Listen to me well, my fiends, while I reveal a tale of fright that all too soon sure ensends and haunts you through the night. Follow my thread through shadows deep. Look out for the dead. Watch out for the creep.
Tonight's Scarborough is about three disrespectful young men who attempted to vandalize the landmarks of the old city St. Augustine. They soon found themselves older, if not wiser, after attempting to desecrate one of the city's most famous attractions, the Fountain of Youth. Prologue. Young men are full of unspent energy. Some are also full of disdain that lingers on from a childhood that lacked boundaries. When such men encounter sacred objects, they approach them with scorn and abuse instead of reverence. By such assaults, they may unite dead enemies. Fountain of Youth. John, Mike, and Dan were on spring break in the old city of St. Augustine, Florida. They were frat boys blowing off steam from the rigors of university studies under the prevailing influence of the spirits. As one might expect, nothing was off limits for them. One of the first things they saw was the water fountain from St. Augustine's sister city in Spain, Willies. It is called the Fuente de los Caños de San Francisco. It features 6 faces shooting water from their mouths into the pool below. They didn't hesitate to mock the landmark. The boys photographed themselves swigging their bottled water until their cheeks were puffed and spewing it out of their mouths at the masked faces mounted on the stonework. It was a sacrilege to the old city, but one that was not unexpected or would go unanswered. They quickly tired of the water fountain and hopped on a trolley to visit the Fountain of Youth, a local park a few miles down the street. Naturally, they wanted to reserve some of their ridicule for that attraction as well. They weren't finished by a long shot. When they saw the spring that Juan Ponce de Leon had named the Fountain of Youth, they took a sip. God damn, it's sulfur water, blurted John as he spat it back into the fountain. At least they could have carbonated it, said Dan. Fuck that, said Mike. They should have infused it with Jack Daniels. Here, I'll do it. The boys laughed as Mike pulled a flask of the liquor out of his pocket and poured it into the old fountain. That stuff will make an old hag look hotter than shit, said Mike. It was their second offense, but the boys laughed and moved on to the next exhibit. They made spectacles of themselves by chasing the roving peacocks that graced the premises with their plumage. At that point, they were told to leave the park, so they waited for another trolley and left. On their way out, however, they noticed a sign that said the park closes at 5 p.m. The sign was only meant to announce the park hours, but the boys saw it as a challenge that deserved a plot to overcome. Therefore, they went to work creating a plan to break into the park that night. They'd come back after dark and look for the easiest path in. When they returned on foot that night, they walked down the street next to their target. They didn't have to look hard. Someone had left the exit gate wide open. Getting in was literally a walk in the park. It was also dark and gloomy, with a blanket of fog, making it nearly impossible to see them. Nevertheless, eyes were watching the boys the moment they set foot past the gate. They were the eyes of the spirits the boys had offended since arriving in the old city. The boys couldn't see them, but they were surrounded as they made their way back to the famous attraction. They planned to shoot videos while they pissed in the Fountain of Youth. Each of them had primed themselves with enough liquor to piss a river. By the time they reached it, they were walking stiff from the discomfort of their swollen bladders. In unison, they unzipped their pants and pulled out their appendages. Before they could release their streams into the fountain, however, a beautiful woman greeted them. They immediately pulled everything back into their pants and zipped up, each hoping to preserve his lost dignity. She was a departed Timequan princess, but they thought she was a college girl dressed up for a party. Her beauty was unfathomable. She was like no one they'd ever seen, and they immediately trusted her without reservation. Her eyes cast an alluring spell on the boys as she smiled. The princess dipped the clamshell into the fountain and took a sip from it, as if she weren't already beautiful enough. Her appearance became all the more irresistible. Her pulchritude was so dramatically enhanced that the boys began to fight over her. She calmed them down by offering each a drink of the magic water from her clamshell. A few moments later, the boys recognized that other people were present. They were Timequan people and men in armor, conquistadors. They were in assembly around them. The assembly looked oddly familiar, like a court of law. Indeed, the young men were on trial. The entire proceeding lasted less than a half an hour, and the verdict was guilty on all counts. There was no defense or opportunity to cross-examine. It was old world justice. In desecrating the city's fountain and landmarks, the boys unwittingly brought the ghosts of the Timequan and the conquistadors into a moment of solidarity. Ancient hostilities were redirected towards the disrespectful boys to protect the sites both groups cherished. To their amazement, though, no sentence was handed down and the assembly disappeared. The only one left was the princess. It was she who told them the bad news. The trial was to find out why they had been punished, not to establish grounds for condemnation. The sequence of punishment followed by trial defied the norms they had always known and left them confused, but the princess explained their sentences by asking them how they felt. "I think I aged 10 or 20 years during the trial," said John. "Me too," said Mike. Just then, Dan began to moan. He was doubled over as waves of pain overcame him. It was pancreatitis, which took his father at 62 years of age. The boys now looked at one another in recognition of the fact that they had aged by decades since they set foot in the park. When they looked at the princess, she was also considerably older, but laughed at them. Within minutes, she had fallen and was in the throes of death. Before she expired, she left them with these words: "Your youth has been taken from you tonight, and now you are old men." As she said these words, they looked at one another in disbelief. Each of them looked as if they were in their late 70s or early 80s. John could feel arthritis in his hands and knees. Mike's vision was failing. The princess resumed in her dying voice: "It is the judgment of our people. Let you suffer the humiliation you visited upon us. We will not pollute our shrines with your stench, but our old enemies are happy to do what must be done. Thus shall you be confined behind the masks you mocked at their fountain, and what remains of your youth will drain from your mouths as you watch it with a stony-faced inability to call for help, even as your people call your names. They'll see you, but they won't recognize you." With that, the princess laughed and died. The three watched in horror as she disintegrated into dust before disappearing into the soil from which she arose. They soon found themselves being escorted outside the gate of the park by a small cadre of Timucuans and conquistadors. When they reached the Fuente de los Caños de San Francisco, the contingent motioned them to step behind the fountain. The back wall of the fountain had swung open and revealed the opposite impressions of the masks. The first 3 masks were already occupied by the remains of 3 other men whose clothes bore the accoutrements of military dress. They pushed John, Dan, and Mike towards their places behind the masks. The trio had no other choice but to shove their faces into the molds. Suddenly, their bodies felt cemented into the fountain structure while their divorced youth churned up from within their stomachs and shot out of their rounded lips with emetic fury into the pool. Then they heard the back of the fountain as it shut them into their positions forever. The small cohort left and marched back to their graves, and there the boys, now withered, remain to this day. Occasionally, the Timucuan princess visits them with her clamshell for a sip. They must watch helplessly as she turns young again and lures more of their disrespectful kind into their fates. Epilogue. The disrespectful boys brought the Timucuan and their Spanish invaders together out of a mutual desire to preserve the integrity of their sacred places. Today, we call it fucking around and finding out. These boys found out the hard way not to fuck around with ghosts.
You see, the dead are not without their devices. They can strike back. So, have some respect for the dead. And never forget that your youth will not last forever. That someday you too will join us. Listen to me well, my fiends, while I reveal a tale of fright that all too soon sure ensends and haunts you through the night. Follow my thread through shadows deep. Look out for the dead. Watch out for the creep.